Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Galit Speaks podcast. I'm here today with another guest, Steve Pearlman. I'm super excited because he's going to talk about something that I feel like is important for everyone across the board. And let me tell you a little bit about him. Since 1992, Steve has taught critical thinking and writing in higher education, including elite liberal arts colleges and universities. In 2011, Steve founded one of the United States' first departments in higher education, specifically focused on teaching critical thinking skills. His work resulted in something exceptionally rare in academia: documented campus wide improvements in critical thinking. A premier expert in critical thinking, Steve has presented at countless educational institutions, conferences, and businesses about improving critical thinking and related habits of mind. He is frequently found in national and international media, including CBS Atlanta, The Hill, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Connecticut Today, First Coast Connect, The Nation Speaks, the Atlanta Journal Constitution, and Point of View Radio. Devoted to the idea that everyone needs access to elite critical thinking skills, Steve founded the Critical Thinking Institute to bring his unique proven methodology to the general public. In addition to academic articles, Steve is the author of America's Critical Thinking Crisis, The Failure and Promise of Education, as well as the host of the podcast for educators, Pedagogy. Did I get that one right, Steve?
Pedagogy.
Pedagogy. Okay, I'm so happy to have you on because I think critical thinking is something that we need in every single part of our life, and every single human needs to have that ability. How did
It-
you get into this?
well, it's sort of a sad story. Started teaching out of college. I was in graduate school, and I started to teach my students to write as a adjunct professor, essentially, or as a gradjunct, as we called it. And when I took a hard look at my students' writing at the end of my first semester teaching, when I had put so much effort and energy and passion into my teaching effort, I realized that they hadn't really improved very much at all.
Mm.
and certainly not in terms of their thinking. Some of their writing techniques had improved maybe a little bit, probably not, but certainly they weren't doing anything much more intellectual than when we started off compared to the first papers.
Wow.
And I realized, hey, that is not what I got into this for at all. And it is not doing the best by my students. And so that began my 30-year journey into figuring out how to teach critical thinking to people, because it's not something, believe it or not, and I think a lot of your audience will appreciate this intuitively, but I can tell you this from a research-based perspective, it's not something on which education focuses. And it's
No.
not something that education figured out how to do. So here I was trying to do this thing that I felt was so important, that everyone agrees is very important, but nobody really felt as though it was being done. And so I've been on a journey figuring out how to accomplish that.
Yeah, and it's kind of almost a deprogramming because we're programmed to take pieces of information in and just be able to spit it back out rather than actually interpret what the data is telling us. How do you go about deprogramming that from students?
It's challenging, but I'll tell you where the root is that's good. Okay. So the
Okay.
problem with the educational system, and I always want to footnote this to say that we have to support our educators. Anyone who's against educators
Mhm.
is making a big mistake. I've worked with thousands of educators, and almost to the point they're all dedicated, good people who want to do right by the students. The educational system that we're in has a problem, which is that
Yeah.
it's, as you said, it's archaic in that it's based on knowledge instead of based on thinking. As I say, we've trapped our educational populace, or the people we educate, our students, to live inside a world of ideas already thought about by other people.
Yeah.
And that's not what we want anymore. Now, it was useful at a certain period in time when there was a very limited amount of knowledge and we had limited access to knowledge. At that point, acquiring knowledge was very powerful. Now, knowledge is not at all the commodity that it used to be in the world. Thinking is. But so while and I'm going to tell you this as well, this is really kind of sad, but they're one of the largest studies done on college writing, on papers written in colleges across the United States, found that only 1 in 5 papers written in college even asked for anything resembling critical thinking.
Wow.
The fact that it asked for it doesn't mean that it got it, mind you, or taught students how to do it, but only 1 in 5 even asked for it. All right. So it's tragic. It's absolutely tragic. Now, that said, here's something that's fascinating, and here's where there's hope. What's fascinating is they've done studies on newborns who are just out of the womb, literally the first day that they're born in the hospital. And they've tested them and they've looked at whether or not they've shown what they did was they showed them an iPad, and the iPad had a certain number of dots on it. And then they played a number of tones at the same time. And the number of tones even either aligned with the number of dots or it did not align with the number of dots. So let's say there were 16 different dots. They played 16 or they played some other number. Newborn babies could tell the difference between whether or not the tones aligned with the dots or not. So if they played 16 tones, they knew. Now, there had to be a big differential. They couldn't play 15 tones. They couldn't tell the difference. But if they played 11 tones, the babies, newborns, understood the difference. We are thinkers by nature. And what's pioneering, I think, about my work is that what I've done is not try to teach critical thinking per se, the way everyone else has been trying to do it. What we've done is look at how do we naturally think? What does our brain naturally do when we think? Because we're thinkers from the time we are born. We're thinkers. How do we tap into that and maximize it as adults or as children later in our lives so as to express what our brains naturally want to do and refine it so we go on to lead better lives?
Yeah, I love that because that's something that I've tried to teach my clients. So in my other business, I own a company and I do financial wellness coaching. And one of the things that I hear all the time is, I'm just not good at math. And then I tell people, but math is everything around you that you're amazing at. Like, if you're an artist, understanding angles and symmetry, that is all math. You are hardwired to understand it and know it. And like, even me sometimes, well, me all the time, actually, like, grab a certain number of items from a bag. I can do that without even, without even trying to grab the correct number of items. Like, I'll put my hand in and it's in my hand. We are hardwired to do things like that and see patterns, and or at least, I know in my line of field and myself personally, like, that's something that's very big with me is I'm able to differentiate patterns, and that's what makes me really what I do. And so we all come to it from a little bit of a different approach, but it's not outside the realm of human nature. And so we can't be not good at it.
That's right. Look, everybody has an inborn natural capacity to think. In fact, our brains are driven to think and to solve problems and so forth. If we weren't that way as a species, we wouldn't be here anymore. Because the only thing that let us survive through evolution, because we weren't faster than the bear, we're not stronger than the bear, we don't have bigger claws and teeth than the bear, was that we could outthink the bear.
Yeah.
Right? So all of our ancestors would have been food, and we wouldn't be having this conversation at all, right? So we're thinkers by nature. Our brains are actually driven to think, and this is very interesting. When our brains resolve an issue, when they solve a problem, when they come to an idea or what have you, we actually release neurotransmitters in our body that do two things. One of them is that these neurotransmitters tell our brains to make more wiring in our brains to do that thing again. Okay. So as we solve certain problems, as we do kinds of certain intellectual work, our brains become better at it. Much like if you do bicep curls all the time as a workout, you're going to get bigger biceps. Well, if we do certain kinds of intellectual work, we get better at that intellectual work. Our brains become more efficient at it because they literally rewire themselves for that. No matter how old we are, they always do that. Wow. The second thing, though, which goes exactly to what you're saying, is that what brains do is the second neurotransmitter makes us happy. They give us pleasure because our brains like solving problems, because if they solve problems, they feel like they're going to keep us alive, which is really all they want to do, is keep us alive. And when they're happy when they're doing that.
That's amazing. I did not know that about I knew that we were constantly creating new neural pathways, but didn't necessarily know that they did those two specific things, which is really cool to understand. And it makes sense, right? Because when we do solve a problem, even if we're doing something like, if you're watching TV and you're solving the mystery before it actually comes out what happens, yeah, you do have this moment of joy of like, oh yeah, I got that. I understood that. I solved that. And it makes total sense that solving problems makes us happy.
Yeah, I would ask all your listeners to think about anything where they've thought about having to solve a problem, how good it felt to do that. It feels good for a reason. It feels good because we're thinkers by nature, and we're designed to enjoy that process. And let's not conflate, though, as you said earlier in the program, which was great, let's not conflate true critical thinking and problem solving and creating ideas and innovating with necessarily what we do in school, which actually uses a very, very limited portion of our brains typically, just those parts built around memorization more than anything else. So, but outside of it, we're doing these rich, complex things and we feel so good. I use the analogy, even when you can't find your keys and you're trying to figure out where you left your keys and finally you find them, you feel this sense of relief, right? And you can see people physically get sort of tensed up when they can't find their keys right? Because that's how we're designed. Our brains don't like it when we can't figure stuff out because it's a threat to us. And then we do it, it's a release because now, okay, I found my keys. I can survive again. I can go out and get food, right? It's associated with all these things. So yeah, it's really baked into us.
So how do we turn on that muscle? Like, what's the first step to start towards a life involving more critical thinking?
That's a great question. And I'll answer it in two different ways. One's an unfortunate answer and one's a great answer. Okay. The unfortunate answer I'll give first, which is that if you really want to understand the ins and outs of it and all the details, then that's the kind of work we do with people at the Critical Thinking Institute online with our program. Because there's a lot involved in it. It's actually very easy. Kids can learn it because, this is natural for us. It's just a matter of someone showing you the path, right? Just like the analogy I use is that running is a natural process for just about everyone on the planet. We can all run, right? But that doesn't mean that if you want to run faster, you don't have a coach. Right. And we've developed methods for training people to run faster or longer distances or whatever it is you want to do with running. Right. So we have some very specific methods that are neuroscientific. They work based on brain function and how we naturally want to think from the time that we're babies moving forward. It's actually how even single cell organisms on the planet do similar things. We just do it, a million times better than they do.
Wow.
Okay, so that's the formal answer. The informal answer is what everyone can do that I advise everyone to do because it takes very little time and it will make you such a better thinker right off the bat, is to keep what I call a metacognitive journal. And metacognition is a very fancy term for just saying being aware of your thinking when you're thinking it, right? Being able to think about the thinking that you're thinking. That's what metacognition is, okay?
Okay.
So most people who keep a journal, they keep a journal about what happened that day. I did this, Susie said that in response to me, right? And then this happened, and then I decided to have this, and I felt this way. And those are very valuable. I'm not in any way disparaging those kinds of journals. They're great. Keep a journal or a diary if you want to record what happens in your life. It's a wonderful thing to do. But what I'm suggesting is something just a little bit different. What I suggest is, instead of keeping a journal about what happened, or even what you thought about what happened, I want you to keep a journal about why you thought what you thought about what happened. What happened in your brain that led you to think a certain thing or react a certain way? What went on? What were you weighing? What were you evaluating? Right? What pieces of information stood out to you? What pieces of information weren't very important to you? What biases did you have? What in your upbringing made you sort of feel this way about things, or react certain ways, or do certain things? And all of that lets everyone on earth very quickly start to become very self-aware, or at least to a degree self-aware, because you won't get all the picture. You'll get a percentage of it. You'll get to a degree more self-aware of how your brain works and why it thinks the things that it thinks. And that will let you start to control it. If we don't know what our brains do, and almost no one does, right? I mean, almost no one knows what our brains do when they think things, right? How does it go through the process of coming to an idea? What's actually happening in your brain when it comes up with an idea where it solves a problem, and why is it doing those things? And we can explain that, but you can start to at least start to understand it. And in starting to understand it, you can become better at it. You can control it a little bit for yourself.
Yeah, and I love that idea, because you can also, it's almost, I don't want to say this is instead of therapy, because it's not, but it gives you at least an insight into the things that you might need to work on,
Right,
in order to become a healthier person overall. And not,
right.
it helps with the critical thinking for sure, but it also helps with everything else in your life. So I love that idea.
Yeah, I can't think of anything in our lives. I don't think anyone can think of anything in our lives that couldn't be improved, or is not even governed in certain respects by thinking, right?
Yeah.
I mean, thinking permeates, because it is what we do. It permeates everything that we do all the time in our lives. And there are moments, of course, when we're not thinking as much as others, for sure, right? But thinking is the thing that determines so much about what we are able to do, how we're perceiving ourselves, how we're perceiving the world, and so on and so forth, that it's a shame that we are not given an operating manual for our own brains from early on in our lives, so we know how to work this thing that is governing us. And I think, unfortunately, most of us are more governed by our brains than we are able to govern them.
Yeah, 100%. Like, we do not, in most cases, we do not recognize why we react in the way that we do. We do not recognize why we went down a certain path, in our thoughts. And if we were able to kind of step back and analyze that, as, when you're writing it in a journal, you can almost think about it in third person, right? Looking at yourself and analyzing it without the biases that are innately coming when you're just thinking about it.
Yeah, that's right. We won't be free of bias, and we can never be perfectly free of bias. But you're right, in becoming in third person, or becoming a little more objective about it, and in writing about it. Writing is a phenomenally powerful thing for the brain. We're able to do a lot more than we would otherwise. And I would encourage everyone as well not to keep your journal, your metacognitive journal, on your computer. There's actually very different kinds of brain function that happens when we write things by hand than when we write them than when we type them. It's
It's so
integrated.
funny, because that was going to be my next question,
Yeah.
because I have a totally different relationship with handwriting things than I do with typing things on the computer. And I was like, I hope this is not something that I have to do on a computer in order to save it. It's funny, because you can merge the two, which is what I started doing, which is you can get a program that you hand write on an iPad, and then it turns it into a digital file
Yes.
that
Yeah.
you can then keep. So I'm so glad that you said that handwriting it out is the way to go. It's funny, even in high school, college, I wrote all of my papers by hand. and then type them up because I just couldn't. I don't know what happened. When I got in front of a computer, it just would not flow. Is that something that you've seen or recognized in people?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So neurologically, right? And my mea culpa is I type a lot directly when I'm writing things that are more academic or, what have you, because I type much faster than I write. But not for personal things or for other things I'm trying to figure them through, because it's just an entirely different brain experience for us when we are writing by hand instead of when we are typing. And in fact, this is very interesting as well. There's a different thing that happens when we're writing script than when we're writing print by hand. Those are actually also different neurologically. And I think we've done a great disservice to a lot of kids these days if we're no longer teaching cursive. It was called cursive when I was a kid, cursive in the schools, because it's doing certain things for their brain that are very important in terms of their association with language. That doesn't happen when we're teaching them to print or to type. And students who learn to write script, cursive, actually can still read print. But students who learn to write print can't necessarily read cursive.
Yeah. So what is it about cursive that's different, or what is happening differently in your brain?
So without getting too technical about it, I mean, the basic gist is you're creating connection between letters, and each letter is for your brain treats each letter as an idea. So you're creating a connection between those things because you're never separating them, right? And so then you're also forming things as a matter of fluidity, as flow and continuousness, and rather than as something that's more staccato for your mind. And then it has to try to piece these letters together again. In essence, kind of what happens is your brain has to, when you write in print, your brain has to try to piece the letters together into a word. When you're writing in cursive, it more considers the word to be a word as a whole unit.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's really kind of weird how our brains work. And don't even get me started on reading. So writing is a very strange thing to do. Reading is so strange for our brains to do. It is one of the hardest things our brain learns to do. Learning to speak a language for our brains very easy. We're well built for that. We have to do it by the time we're about 4 or 5 years old. Then we can learn other languages, but we have to have a syntax based in by that time. But it's pretty easy. You've seen kids pick it up. Kids pick it up very easily. Language.
Yeah.
Reading, much harder, because reading forces us to do things like associate eye movement and eye recognition with language. There's no reason our language center is associated with eye recognition. It doesn't really, those parts of our brain are not naturally connected in any way, and other parts as well. So we're doing all these weird things in our brain. They have to work hard to wire themselves to get us to read. It's really strange stuff.
That's interesting. And it makes sense that reading and writing were things that were held back from oppressed peoples when they wanted to stay oppressed, because it is tied with critical thinking and with thinking in general, and being able to gain knowledge and then evaluate that knowledge. So
That's right. I think of all the things we can learn. Yeah. And it's such a shame. And not only that, we can record a thought down and evaluate it later for ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that's a very powerful thing to be able to do.
Yeah. And I think in modern society, I think we take it for granted a little bit that we have this wealth of information available to us, and that we've been taught at least how to process it.
We're drowning in it though, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we do take it for granted, but we're really drowning in it. We're drowning in it in two ways. And one way is that people don't understand the difference between different kinds of information they get online in terms of the source of that and the validity of that and the reliability of that information, because it's hard for us to discern the difference sometimes, right? And our brains don't really discern the difference from a deep down in our brains. Information is information. We have to work hard to teach it the difference between what's coming into it and filter it differently. But the other problem is there's too much information. There's so much out there, but we don't have the reason. We're not taught the reasoning capacity to think about it and use it well. And that's the difference. And that's what we really focus on. So what if you have a whole bunch of information? I was doing consulting for the Air Force, and some people in intelligence there, they actually wrote a paper, an article on this as well, or several articles have been written, that they said, and these are people who are trying to figure out, these are intelligence officers. And they said, look, the problem used to be 20 years ago, 30 years ago, getting the right information, getting enough information about what was happening, getting the data was hard. They said, now we have more data than we know what to do with. What we don't have anymore are people who know how to interpret and evaluate that data and think about that data to make it useful. So we have so much information in the world, more than we've ever had before, but has it made all of our lives that much better? Are we really happier? Are we really doing better and thriving more because of all this information? We're not, because we don't have the thinking skills we need, and our kids don't have the thinking skills they need to negotiate that information well.
Yeah. So when do we start? So what is the best time to start with critical thinking training?
As soon as kids become verbal, that's when we start with. That's the best time to start, because at that point, once we have a word, we have an idea. And once we have an idea, we can start working with them. Now, obviously, a 3-year-old in their limited vocabulary isn't going to do nearly as much as a 10-year-old, as a 15-year-old, and so on and so forth. So we're going to start in very simple ways, right? But that's really when we want to start. And we don't want to think, as I pointed out earlier, that kids don't have a capacity for thinking. Kids, by the time they're 16 months old, can tell the difference between someone who's telling them something true and someone who's telling them something false.
Really?
By 16 months old, they can start to discern the difference. Kids are, because we're wired to think. We are thinkers, right? We are really, in a lot of respects, our bodies only are two things. Okay, if we really boil down what we're here about, right? The human body does two things. Okay, it's about surviving enough to procreate, which is like all species on the planet. That's all they're really built to do, is to survive enough to procreate. And we have one other thing that we're able to do that the other species can't, which is that we're here to think, because that is how we survive, to procreate, right? Yeah. Unlike most of the other species, they survive more through physical efforts than they do through intellectual efforts. Okay, so the way we survive to procreate is we do that. So one example I give that I love is this. When my son was about 4, maybe 5 years old, I'm going to say he was 5 years old, probably 4. But my wife and I were sitting in our family room, and my son was playing. He was in the playroom, and he was using Lego because he loves Lego, still loves Lego. And we hear and my wife had just baked some cookies, and they were out on the island in the kitchen cooling. And we heard a little pitter patter of his feet coming towards us in the family room. He was clearly coming to see us and say something or what have you. And he stopped at the island, and clearly he saw the cookies, but he was not tall enough to reach the cookies. So then we heard the feet stop, and he paused, and then he walked away, and he went down the hall into the bathroom. Why did he go to the bathroom? Because in the bathroom, we had a little stool by the sink so that he could wash his hands. And all of a sudden we hear that pitter patter coming back down the hallway, and we hear the stool be placed down next to the island, and he got himself a cookie and went back into his playroom. Now, my son at that point knew he could have asked us to have a cookie. He also knew that we were not going to tell him that he could not have a cookie at that time, because it was it was about getting close to dinner time. We weren't going to let him have a cookie. He thought through that whole thing, right? At 5, he figured out, I want a cookie. They're not going to give me a cookie. I've got a stool in the bathroom. I'm going to get the stool and get myself a cookie, and I'm not going to mention it to my parents. I'm going to go back to my playroom. That's amazing problem solving, right? And that's what we're here to do. So kids are really able to do amazing things. And unfortunately, our educational system doesn't encourage that, right? It doesn't build on that skill. And we really want to do that. So don't, from as early as you can, always treat your kids like problem solvers and thinkers and idea creators. It's really what they're here to do, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things that stuck with me from childhood was this idea to ask questions, to always be asking questions of whatever I was learning, to be able to kind of understand it deeper or to understand it at all. Because a lot of times, like we said, it's memorization. And I did, memorization is great, but that's not the things that stuck with me. It was always the things that I asked questions about and got interested in, that those were the things that I used and have stuck with me throughout my whole life. So is that something that you should be doing with kids?
Absolutely. All of our brains are designed to work on what's meaningful, right? And that's from a neurological perspective. Again, they really work on not information's useless if it doesn't have meaning to our brains, if they don't use it,
Mm-hmm.
because our brains are survival mechanisms. So if we learn a bunch of stuff, as we unfortunately often do in school, that has no application in our lives, our brains don't care about that stuff. Why should they?
Right.
Right? Because it's not doing anything for us. It's not making our lives meaningful. But something that's meaningful to you is wonderful, because it's your gateway into thinking about things and learning and memory and recall and all these things and so forth, right? And so one of the things that we're always telling parents is, it doesn't matter what your children read. It doesn't matter what your children are curious about. Encourage it, right? Encourage it,
Yeah.
because they're still building their brains well to do that. So I'm also a martial artist. And
Okay.
and as a kid, I liked to read a bit when I was a younger kid. I read and did different things. I wasn't as much of an avid reader, certainly, as I am now, and so forth, about various different things. But I read as a kid. I had books. I was taught to read from a very early age, and so on and so forth. Um, but I didn't really get turned on to reading until I could read about martial arts. Uh, and
Mm.
when I started to be able to read about martial arts, I read voraciously. But what difference does it make? My parents would say, "Why are you only reading about martial arts? Why don't you read about these other things?" And at the moment, that was what gave meaning to me, was martial arts. But the thing is, I still developed reading skills and thinking skills around martial arts, but those are the same skills that I'm using today. That's just
Yeah.
where they formed. That was just the context for them, but the context doesn't matter. It's the skill set that matters. So
Yeah.
wherever your kids have passion for reading and intellectual growth, encourage it. Fan that flame, because you're only building wiring to think about anything down the road.
Yeah, I think I was having this conversation recently with someone where they were telling me about how so it a little bit crazy, but like I was a crazy reader as a child, to the point where like the punishment was they would take away my books. If something that was like the ultimate, like if you wanted to like crush me, take away all my books and don't let me read. Um, but another friend of mine had said something similar, but it was a musical instrument. And I thought, how sad is this, that you're going to take away the thing that the kid is developing the skills on.
Right.
And that always seemed counterintuitive to me, of like, why aren't you happy that I'm doing this thing regardless of I don't know, whatever else I did today.
Yeah, I don't know your parents, but I would have words with them about taking away your books for any reason. Let's find some other way to correct poor behavior than taking away books. It's just, that is not a great idea.
Yeah. So would that be just for books, or because I'm kind of feeling like you're saying anything that the child is super into, as long as it's not hurting anyone and it's something that's expanding in their mind, you know, we should be able to give them that latitude and let them explore.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very simple question, right? Is it growing the brain or not growing the brain? Right? That's the thing that they're doing. Is it growing it in a good way? Is it not growing it, or is it growing it in a bad way? Because we can grow our brains for bad habits as well. Our brains will wire themselves and reinforce whatever we do. Okay, so it's it's a very simple question. When we look at what our children are doing, is it growing their brains in a good way? And if it is, encourage that. Absolutely encourage that. And that's also involved in certain physical things. Physicality affects brain growth. We don't only want to be, about physical things, about sports or whatever. We want to do intellectual things as well. But, whatever it is, are we doing healthy things for the brain or unhealthy things for the brain?
Yeah.
And if it's healthy, that's great. Let's keep encouraging that. Let's build that as much as we can, because what else would we want for our children but to grow up to have the most vibrant brains that they possibly could for their lives to follow, right? And it doesn't ever stop. We're always rewiring our brains, as I said, so we can always change. But nevertheless, we're always building wiring for something. That's what I really want to emphasize. Our brains are always wiring themselves around what we do. They're always building more wiring for something. The question is, what's the something? Is it a healthy something, a good something, or is it a negative something, right?
Yeah.
Which one is it?
So does that translate then to adulthood as well? If you get really into something, should we be kind of throwing ourselves into it as much as we can, as long as it's something that's healthy for our brain or growing our brain?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If there's something that's passionate, if it's healthy for you, you don't have to throw yourself into it 10,000%. But if it's something you enjoy, pursue it. It's only doing good things for you. If it's a healthy, constructive thing, then that's great. And it's amazing what our brains are able to accomplish when we do these kinds of things, because we're really able to start to cultivate a brain that's going to do that better. And what they find is that one of the big differences between experts in a field and novices in a field, in terms of what happens in their brain when they attack a problem in the field, and that could be anything. A field doesn't have to be a specific career or a specific discipline. It could be anything that we do in life, right? Is that the expert brains, because they're wired for it better, because they've built wiring over the years, actually are much more efficient at it than the novice brains. They have pathways already built that are very economical to do this kind of work.
Yeah.
And so if you want to get better at something, really it's just practice. And that's what lets our brains develop that. One thing that I tell people is that this is a fascinating thing that happened. They did a study on, and they've replicated this in different sports, but I'll use this for an example, on basketball players. And what they did, professional basketball players, was they had them watch footage of a player doing a jump shot. And they stopped the footage just before the ball left the player's hand. So the player's still touching the ball, but they're in the process of the jump shot. They stopped the footage. And they showed that footage to professional basketball players, to basketball coaches, to sports writers, and to lay people who were just big basketball fans. And they said, did he make the shot? Did the ball go in the basket? And the basketball players were able to tell the best as to whether or not the ball went in the basket. And then the next people were the coaches and sports writers, and finally the lay people. And the reason is their brains are so wired to understand that physical motion and those physics and all the things involved in that, that they could see whether or not that ball was going to go into the basket before it left the player's hand the best. No one was 100% right, of course. No group always got it right or wrong, but they could see it so much better than everybody else, because they understood so many of the things that were happening there that the rest of us don't see.
Yeah, that's incredible, because it's minor, it's minor details that they're able to perceive. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So you said you love martial arts. I really like watching UFC, and I've always found that because I do not participate, it is always a little bit harder for me to see exactly what's going on, or for me to perceive exactly what's going on, than it is I'm usually sitting next to someone who does it professionally, or even does it on an amateur level, and can automatically, like, they're already seeing the move way ahead of me, and I'm like, did you just see what happened? Like,
Yeah,
So
that's exactly it. Experience breeds insight, right? And training breeds insight into things. If it didn't, it would be worthless to do it.
yeah.
So yeah, that's exactly the point.
Amazing. And I want to ask you a question, and this might bring the conversation in a little bit of a different direction and maybe a little bit of a downer. But we had spoken a little bit about critical thinking. I want to speak about it in terms of preventing SA or sexual assault. And I want to know your thoughts on that and how, because this is something that is going on quite often in our communities, and it's something that most people will be faced with at some point in their lives.
Yeah, it's a terrible thing. Statistically speaking, for a while, and I haven't read the statistics in a year or two, but it was about 1 in 4 women to 1 in 5 women just in college, by the end of college career, face some kind of sexual assault. And that was not even looking at them throughout the rest of their lives, unfortunately. So it's really an epidemic kind of problem that we're facing here in this culture. And there's so many things about it in our culture that are problematic. And we're changing a lot of that very slowly. And I'm glad we're changing it, but it's very problematic. But one of the things, the way that critical thinking ties into it is, unfortunately, that, our brains work on certain kinds of scripts, that we have expectations for how conversations are going to go and for what words mean. So words don't necessarily mean to the listener what they mean to the speaker, right? And we've all heard this before, because we've all had conversations with people where they've said a certain thing and we've heard it a certain way. It's landed on us differently than what they meant. And we had to go through a lot of work to figure out, well, what were you trying to say? That's what you meant when you said that? I didn't know that's what you meant when you said that.
Yeah.
Right. And so, unfortunately, and this was a little truer a little while back, but it was more about men and women originally, and now it's still just about miscommunication between people of any gender who are interacting within each other. It doesn't matter if it's male or female or however people gender identify. But we have different ideas of the scripting for what's going to happen in terms of things. So for a long time, the expectation was that men would think that women, of course, are going to say no or resist in a certain way sexual activity, and that they didn't really mean it necessarily when they said no, because that was what their script was. They were supposed to say no to look nice in terms of society, even if they really still wanted to participate in some sexual activity. Okay? And so our brains got in the way of that. And that's not to defend any actions that were against a woman or any person who said that they were not fully committed to wanting to do something. If they're not fully consenting, then they're not consenting. I'm not excusing that in any way. What I'm saying is that neurologically, though, from a brain perspective, we're always doing that. We're always having expectations for how we're going to understand things that actually shape our understanding for things. And they sometimes do it in ways that are immoral or illegal or what have you. And they're not excuses for things. They're just as equally problematic. But there are nevertheless reasons for why those things are occurring. So much of thinking, especially when we're in interpersonal discourse, is about putting our individual biases aside and trying to understand somebody else's perspective from what they're saying, what they mean by things, not what we think they mean by things, because we already know what we think they mean by things. What good does that do us, right? That's not really thinking then. That's just succumbing to bias, really, is all that is. It's programming. True thinking means putting our individual perspective aside on what we think somebody means and trying to understand what they really mean. That creates dialogue, and that's positive and so forth. So, of course, as we look at that issue of consent, we should be thinking of consent as something that's active, not as something that's passive. Consent cannot be passive. We really want to hear active consent from people, is what we call it. Affirmation of things that are happening, not just a lack of a no, but the existence of a yes.
Yeah.
Okay? But that also means that we have to be humble enough intellectually and disposed enough intellectually to actually listen and not hear them based on our biases, but hear them based on what they're really trying to communicate. And unfortunately, that takes more dialogue for people. Sometimes we have to stop and we have to be willing to dialogue and to understand. And obviously that's way beyond just things with consent. That's with just any interaction with other people all the time. But I think so much of what we want to do, if we want to be good thinkers and we want to train our brain to think well, is to put aside our biases in terms of how we understand and instead try to hear what people are trying to say. And that's not only true with sexual assault and sexual consent, but today with politics, with just good interpersonal relationships and so forth, right? We are not listening to each other as much as we could be. We are biased and putting our perspectives forward and our interpretations forward first. And that's a mistake for us intellectually, no matter what we do.
Yeah. And I wonder, is there a way, so coming at it from the perspective of the receiver of the sexual assault, is there a way that they can critically think themselves out of the situation or not enter the situation? How can they get around being in that spot?
Right. So the backstory on this is that I was a subject matter expert for the U.S. Army on sexual assault prevention. I've written programming for colleges when I owned Student Success with some partners of mine that millions of college students have seen. Some of your listeners might very well have seen programming videos about sexual assault prevention and alcohol abuse prevention that I authored. And so that's where my expertise on this is coming from. It's not just from the critical thinking perspective individually. I'm just saying that so your listeners understand why I'm able to speak about some of these things. One of the things that we always taught everyone to do was to work, whether, whoever you are, if there's a pressing sexual assault situation of which you might become the subject, is to, and this isn't if somebody jumps out of the bushes with a knife necessarily, which is much rarer than what we see in other kinds of sexual assault. This is if you're in you semi-consensually went to a room or something and something's happening now that's getting out of control, that's beyond your consent, which happens, unfortunately, is to open dialogue. We use what we call verbal defense or verbal deflection in order to distract their brains from the initial intention, which could be by asking questions or could be with working with their desire to affect the sexual assault, whether it's conscious or subconscious, right? So, for example, we get feedback. We had thousands of people respond to us with this, that they were in a bad situation. They went back to somebody's room or what have you, and things were going farther than they had intended or in a way that they hadn't liked, and they had protested in some way, and it really wasn't working very well because now we're in a conflict.
Right?
And what happens sometimes if we tell somebody, no, you're wrong, they're going to say, yes, I'm right? So sometimes when we push back against a mind, if they're not being open-minded, a lot of people say, oh, I'm sorry, right? I didn't mean to do that, right? But that's not the situation we're worried about.
Right.
So for someone who's resisting that, the trick is sometimes what we can do is, without consenting, because we don't necessarily consent to what's happening, what we can do is not also directly resist in direct opposition. So you can say, ooh, you have bad beer breath. Could you go brush your teeth? Well, when they go brush their teeth, you can leave potentially, right? Or something like that can happen. Right. And so the trick with thinking is, if we ask questions, the brain is naturally triggered to try to respond to them. And if we don't necessarily directly oppose, and I'm not saying to consent, but we don't necessarily directly oppose somebody's thoughts, they don't argue back. And instead we can find a way to resist and to not have to give consent and to get out of that situation without just doing it in terms of direct opposition. Now, direct opposition also works sometimes, right? So I'm talking about where that hasn't worked. You might say, no, I don't want to do this, very clearly, and they're not responding to that, or it's making it worse, right? So now we're looking for another option in that respect. And to be honest, I'll never forget this, ever in my entire life. I got an email from one woman. She watched our programming. This was months or maybe a year later or so, and she found herself on a date with somebody. They went back to this person's apartment, this guy's apartment, and things were starting to get very wrong. And she didn't really specify what it was, but she just felt this was a terrible situation. Something was very wrong here. And she wanted to get out, and she couldn't really get out of it directly. She couldn't physically escape necessarily. She couldn't get out. And she was very concerned for herself. And she remembered what we talked about asking questions, just keeping them talking, establishing dialogue, and so forth. And she did that. She did that for long enough where she was able to get out of the situation safely. 2 weeks later, that man was arrested. He was a serial killer.
Whoa.
Yeah. So in very good likelihood, to what she said, we saved her life that day. So I sleep really well with that, but it speaks to the power of this. And it's no different than everyone should learn in terms of de-escalating a fight in martial arts. It's the same kind of tactics. It's just applied in that context. Police learn how to de-escalate situations. Everyone should learn how to de-escalate arguments instead of escalate arguments. We naturally can escalate them. We're just not all great at de-escalating them.
Yeah. And you think that the best way to try is to just engage the mind by asking questions that they have to answer.
It certainly takes a little more training than that, but yeah, that's a great initial tip, right? Which is brains are naturally triggered by questions to answer them. And if we're able to start asking questions, we're able to start controlling the nature of what somebody's doing with us better than if we're sometimes just arguing back with them, where the brains can shut down and just become more resistant. And that's true anytime you've had an argument with somebody, right? Yeah. We know that we all dig in sometimes to our positions rather than open ourselves up.
Yeah.
And asking questions, no matter what the context, does have positive neurological effects. Can't say that it will work all the time. Nothing works all the time for everybody in every situation. And so that's always a problem. We have to try to figure these things out from different perspectives sometimes. But ask questions. Yes, start to open dialogue and do it by asking questions. And don't let them control the dialogue by asking as many questions back, which is what people will naturally do instinctively sometimes as well. Well, why did you do that? What do you mean? Well, wait a second. I want to understand what you mean first. Could you explain a little further? And just try to pursue it from that perspective.
I love that. Thank you so much. And if people want to learn about critical thinking, what are the different ways that you work with people?
Well, I either do direct consulting with corporations. For a long time, I worked with educators. I still do that, but not as much now. I taught thousands of educators our methods for teaching critical thinking and understanding what it is and how to work with students. But if people want it directly, either adults themselves or parents with kids who want it for their kids or families, please come to the Critical Thinking Institute at thectinstitute.com. We are about to launch, and you can purchase it now in advance for an amazing discount, our online programming for kids and families, and separate one for adults. The one on kids is animated. It's a lot of fun. It's just as good as the one for adults. So if you're just an adult who really likes watching cartoons, that's the better one for you, to be honest, than watching me talk to you at all times, because who wants to see that? But anyway, so come to the Critical Thinking Institute, and we'll take you through a program of understanding your own brain and understanding how to operate it better in any situation, for any kind of problem solving that needs to be done, for any ideas you need to do, for how to be a better parent, how to be better at your career, how to be a better friend, how to solve the problems and make better decisions in life. That's what it's really about, because it's so ironic that we don't know how to work our own brains. And it should be what we learn most. It should be the most important thing we learn, is how to operate this thing up here, because as I said, it's either going to control us or we can try to control it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. And so how do they reach out to you? Is it just through the website?
Yep, best way to do it. Yeah, go to the website, thectinstitute.com. And then for parents listening, we also have a podcast called Parentology, That's again, parentology. And that's every week we give you about a 15-minute little snippet on a little tip you can do that's very easy with your kids to help them be better thinkers. It's not really critical thinking training. It's just a little tiny tip about something, a way to approach a conversation or something that's more positive for the brain instead of negative. And over time, those things can accumulate, but they're all very quick, easy little things to do.
That's great. And where can they find the podcast?
Anywhere you find podcasts, pretty much. Most of the major streaming services, Apple, Spotify, SoundCloud, Podbean, etc. We're on all of it. So just find whatever podcast service you usually listen to. We're probably on there.
Yeah. And then the adult podcast, you have that one too, right?
Yeah, that's really for educators. The Pedagogy, we call it, is a podcast for educators. If you're not an educator, you're more than welcome to listen, but it might bore your brains out. It might just run out your ears, because we're talking about the research around educational theory for teaching critical thinking and teaching other things. So if you're not an educator, that one might not be for you. But we have a bunch of non-educators who listen to it. They just geek out on it the way we do. That's cool. But if you're a parent, parentology is the one you want to go to.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Steve. This was such valuable information, and I really hope that someone hearing this will be able to not only get themselves to a place where they're actively doing more critical thinking, but to a place where they get themselves out of a situation. And it doesn't have to just be sexual assault. You could be in a room with a serial killer and not know it. Right. And this could save your life. So I'm so incredibly glad and honored that you came on and shared this with us.
It's been my pleasure. What a great series of questions. I've enjoyed this so much. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, so please, thank you so much. Please make sure that this gets to somebody who needs to hear it. If you're listening now on the replay, ask questions. I will be there and I will answer them. I will share Steve's information. Go out, get the information that you need, and keep this conversation going. Like, subscribe, share, do all of the things. And if you need to reach me, I am Galit Speaks everywhere. Have a great night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.